We are grateful for your presence here this morning. Well, actually, it's afternoon, early afternoon, 2 minutes into the noon time. So thank you all for joining us here for this incredibly important conversation. We've got a number of panelists here who have been doing work together as part of this racial equity profile, and I'm grateful to join this virtual stage with everyone present here and each of you, because what we know, and we've talked about this a lot, is that we may be people in a position of power and influence inside of institutions, but nothing can change without the community actually wanting to and doing the work to change and to transform who we are and who we're becoming. If we leave it to other people, it won't happen. And that means not just us as leaders, but you as community members, you as individuals working in anything from healthcare to the nonprofit sector, to the for-profit sector. We're going to dig into that a little bit. So I want to just take a moment here, let everyone introduce themselves, and I'm going to begin with a presentation, and as usual, we'll go into a panel. So I'm going to go ahead and Dr. Hopkins, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Sure. Leroy Hopkins, a retired professor of German from Millersville University.
Stacy.
Hi, Stacy Blake, CEO at YWCA Lancaster.
Elisa.
Hi, Elisa Jones, CEO at Union Community Care.
Sam.
Hello, everyone. Sam Bresci, CEO at Lancaster County Community Foundation.
Vanessa.
Vanessa Filbert, CEO of Community Action Partnership.
And Dr. Amber.
Hello, Amber Sessoms. I am the Chief Visionary Officer of Natural Inclination and your moderator today.
So thank you all, and I'll invite you all to drop to mute and drop your video off for now, and we'll invite you back here in a few minutes. So I am Kevin Ressler. I'm the President and CEO of United Way of Lancaster County. I am grateful, as I said, for this conversation and for your participation. I'm really excited. We've got a good number of you here today. We've got right now 110 people in this Zoom. We have over 200 registered. This is the highest number of registrants we've had for one of these conversations about our community. And that's extremely valuable and important because, as I said before, in order for us to be transformed as a community, we need everyone to be involved. Interest is not action, but action doesn't happen without interest. And so thank you all for being here. I'm going to invite my colleague here, Olivia, to go ahead and share the screen that we've got prepared for you here. So today's topic is the state of racial equity in Lancaster County. Now, many of you yesterday volunteered, attended events, and those types of things for MLK Day, and it is incredibly important that we do that work of digging in and being community together. It is also incredibly important that MLK Day is not the only day that we think about racial justice issues, economic justice issues, health equity issues, all these things we'll talk about today. If that is the only day that we talk about it, then it is simply a wonderful way for us to feel better about ourselves and to move on without any transformative change. So this is day one of let's now talk about how we make action part of our social fabric and our commitment. Before we begin, I just want to let you all know, as a piece of housekeeping, United Way will be hosting a two-on-one resourcing day. Go ahead and next slide. We'll be hosting a two-on-one resourcing day. We are excited. Senator Bob Casey will be in person keynoting. He's been providing some great support, including some significant funding to transform how we do referrals through two-on-one, which is an incredibly important part of the conversation of equity for us here at United Way. Last year in Lancaster County, we did over 65,000 contacts for individuals. What we're going to be revealing to you is how we not only know who did we give a referral to, but did they receive the service and how quickly, and how are we making sure we get people to all the places they need to be with as limited of trauma experiences of telling their story again and again. Really excited about that. Next slide. Just briefly here, the day will include There we go. The day's agenda will have a bunch of workshops for you nonprofit leaders and even for-profit businesses. If you have something that can help us talk about how to better resource the nonprofit community benefit sector, please reach out. We'll be talking about education, health, economic mobility, equity, and more. So please reach out, and we'll have agendas throughout. The agenda will have different events throughout the day, followed by a release of our next round of Level Up and Launch grants. Last year we gave out $500,000, which was leveraged to $750,000 into the community. Please, everyone, if you are unable to help with that cost, let us know. We want to make sure no one is left behind. So without further ado, we're going to hop over to this presentation. So the first slide I want to share with you here, what is equity? This question is, let me go to the next slide. This question of equity versus equality often comes up. This curiosity, the words sound the same, but what do they actually mean? I'm going to show you a couple of slides. You may have seen, if you've ever done anti-racism analysis training or some other training to help us think about how do we actually treat people with different circumstances in a way that's equitable, not equal. What does that mean? So if we look at this version of the slide, on the far left, we see this is reality. Some people have way more assistance, have way more resources, wealth, all these things than others. Some are starting not just on the ground, they've actually structurally been put beyond the bare minimum we would expect for standing. Equality is giving everyone the same resource to be able to see the game. And obviously, this does not achieve an equitable result. We've got equity. We see that, now we are looking at the objective to get over that barrier, and we're giving individuals what is necessary to accomplish that task. And then, of course, lastly, we've got liberation in this version, which is just removing the barrier. Next slide. Another version of this sort of conversation is how we think about equity in terms of justice. So inequality is unequal access to opportunities. On the top left, we see that one person happens to have had the apple. That's just what happened, and the other person isn't getting fed. Equity, as we've addressed, is giving the individuals what's necessary to reach in this case, the apple to be fed. Customizing tools, understanding and addressing the inequity that leads to inequality. Equality, of course, is evenly distributing the tools and the assistance doesn't help. And then justice is actually fixing the system to offer equal access to both tools and opportunities. So we've straightened the tree. We don't need to have a different height ladder here. Next slide. So that's just a little bit of a precursor talking about equity. So I want us to understand that equity is beyond just racial equity. So we have to think about things like disability rights. We have to think about things like individuals, orientations from their sexual preference, sexual identity, these various things that may have systemic, legal, or other barriers to an individual. But what we're really talking about today is the Lancaster County Racial Equity Profile. This profile was put together by a group of community leaders here working with PolicyLink and the USC Equity Research Institute. The National Equity Atlas has done this in a variety of communities over the last 10 years and is continuing in their deep awareness, helping organizations, helping communities, helping individuals figure out how do we improve some of these situations that are structural, not just individual actions one to the other. So this collaborative process has taken over the last 18 months or so. If you were at the excellent MLK breakfast yesterday, you would have heard a couple of these stats. So before we get into some of the parts that I want to look at with the stats, we're going to look here at, I just want us to begin with who we think we are. As individuals, right, we come with a different scope and different organizations, and we may say we're diverse, right? So, we're very diverse, great, but are you equitable, right? You have different people, but are all of those individuals without any level of barrier? They just happen to be different, visually diverse, right? So who we think we are may not be inclusive, may not be equitable. So I just want you, this is just mentally for yourself, just think about what kind of diversity does your organization have? What kind of diversity do you represent as an individual? What unique elements do you bring to the table? What is the demographic composition of your organization, right? So not just do we have a number of different people of different racial backgrounds or even abilities, do we actually have a wide range of cultures? Do we have a wide range of sort of economic backgrounds? Right? We don't want to be paying people say, hey, well, we have poor people here because we're not paying them well. That's not the objective. But do people come from different lived experiences? And are we able to work together to have a broad understanding? Are your compositions as an organization, are they different from who you're supposed to serve, particularly for the nonprofits? Do you have a lot of people working who come from a particular background, serving people whose lived experience is different from theirs, making decisions for them and not having them at the table? And what does this look like from your personal, outside of work relationships, the faith communities that you go to, the social places that you gather? Is there any diversity present in those places? What are you exposed to? Oftentimes when we think about diversity, what we talk about is a very limited scope. We get really broad really fast. And so we don't allow individuals to represent what and who they are. And just as an example, for me as a bicultural, biracial individual whose mother comes from Tanzania, there are often assumptions about me, positive or negative, that may not actually recognize the multiplicity of who I am. I just got back from Tanzania, and one of the things that I found curious, it was a reminder, I haven't been there in a while, but my cousins look at me and they basically call me a word in Swahili called Mzungu, which is a reference for a white person. I am biracial, and to them, they see me, not in a negative fashion, but they see my whiteness as a differentiator. Here in the United States, it's my blackness that is often seen as the visual differentiator because of the way our society interacts with race. Now, this applies to everyone, not just people of color. All people are unique, and when we deny them that uniqueness, we miss opportunities to solve granular problems. We try to take quick fixes. Just as a fun little example, as a person who's studied theater and growing up, one of the things that I always found interesting as a Black actor and the potential I would have had in casting, the people who I saw on screen was, there were sort of archetypes. You had this Samuel L. Jackson, who's the sort of angry Black, really intense guy. You've got Denzel, who's sort of the more dramatic and serious. And you had Will Smith, who's sort of the goofy individual. And pretty much the rest of the characters were just, if they were Black, they were a supporting character, usually a random villain or someone who would die early in the movie. When I thought about this, I noticed this from a potential professional level. But when I actually went to work, at one point I worked at a retail outlet, and we had a break for lunch, and a number of us were sitting around the table. It was my first day. And I went to a table and we were having a good time. A bunch of us were laughing. And as we left the room, an older Black gentleman pulled me aside and he said to me, hey, just so you know, I'm the funny Black guy here, so you're going to have to find a different role. So even for us as people of color, we're often put into positions where we feel that there's limited space and scope for us. So looking at this profile specifically, I want to say, okay, so the demographics. Let's take a real quick look. Who have we been? Who lives in the county, and how is this changing? So if we look at the 1990 statistics there, right, there was 420,000 people. In 2019, 29% growth. We have 540,000 people. We see that there's varying levels of growth in different areas. But what we can see is that we know that this community is continuing to see racial demographic shifts, increasingly less white as the population grows. So how is this changing? In a different way of looking at this, the question is, who are we actually becoming? Not just what we see in our workplace. If we don't diversify our workplaces, we think the community hasn't changed. I went to Conestoga Valley from kindergarten through 12th grade here in Lancaster County as a biracial individual, and I graduated high school in 2003. And when I look at this, I notice mixed other race isn't even on the chart when I'm in early elementary school. So this frames for me as an individual an understanding of my own relationship in the community, the assumptions that people may or may not have made about me. One of my best friends, after 5 or 6 years, comes to my house for a sleepover and asks me, oh, I didn't know that you were adopted, because he didn't have a framework in which an individual who's Black would have a white father. And so this helps me to understand some of my own experience in this county and how it's changed. Even how when my family goes out to eat, The responses of other patrons don't look as sort of quizzically at us when we enter the room with multiple races as a family. This has changed how we are becoming today. And these statistics you see it peels all the way out to 2050. And so if you look on the graph there at the bottom, you can see where we are at sort of 2020 there in that 81%. And we see that we'll continue to diversify in an aggressive fashion. So where are the people of color? Again, for many individuals, you may say, I haven't seen any of these individuals. They're not in my workplace. That's a city of Lancaster issue. And it is true that the concentration of people of color in our county are in the city. I've heard too often a conversation from individuals who say, oh, I'd love to help this issue, but we don't have diversity here. So if we did, we'd treat them very well. We'd treat them very fairly. But the reality is, just because someone isn't in your micro space doesn't mean that they're not in your macro space. Are they not in your workforce? Are they not showing up to interviews because you've already shown them that they're not welcome? And so when we look at this chart, what we see is the county is more diverse racially in places beyond Lancaster City than I think many of us actually think of in a given day-to-day circumstance. Also, part of this is the myopic lens many of us have due to our age. So what this graph shows us, and I think it's helpful for us to think about what is Lancaster. And as we talk about a baseline, it's both who are we and where are we going. We can see from 1980 until 2019, we've got a 6% gap in 1980 between the percent of seniors and the percent of youth who are coming from different groups of color. And in 2019, that gap is 19%, right? Why? Because the youth community are significantly changing from racial diversity level. And so this means that our future, from a workforce level to a relationship level to spaces and places, what places are designed for entertainment and other, there's going to be a cultural difference that you will increasingly feel even if you live in an isolated community yourself. So it's the economy, stupid, right? This famous saying, of course, helps us to understand that what people often really care about is whether or not my pocketbook is better or worse. And so is the county growing good jobs for everyone? This chart is a really valuable one to me to take a look at from the United Way perspective, thinking about, are we making sure that people are able to be well? Not just are they well, but are they able to be well? And what we see here is across the United States, growth in jobs by industry from 2000 to 2020, you see low wage, middle wage, high wage are all on some form of a positive trajectory, with the low wage having slower growth, middle and high wage having higher growth. Here in Lancaster, we've got negative low wage growth, significant middle wage growth, and negative high wage growth. We're not having a diversity of economic opportunities. And when you hopefully take a dig into this profile yourself and read all the sort of the complexities on the left, what you'll see here is that we're not doing a great job of transferring individuals in that middle wage to that high wage place. So support workers are not getting the opportunity to step into that next wage range, which is what allows for wealth building. Particular unfortunate, but jobs, it says, but jobs in high wage industries such as manufacturing, management, professional services, finance, and insurance have declined over the past 2 decades. And we've of course seen this even in the most recent unfortunate scenario where LSC Communications closed and lost 600 jobs. So our earnings were growing for all workers, right? The dinner table conversation is, inflation, can I pay my bills, right? So the real earning conversation here, low, middle, high wage, growth in earnings by industry from 2000 to 2020. We do see growth, but we are largely trailing the country except for that middle wage area. But even the delta there is only 5%, whereas the delta on the high wage is 14%. So is the median hourly wage increasing for all workers? Rising tide lifts all boats, right? But what if the ocean is polluted? Then it doesn't matter, because no matter what happens, everyone is going to suffer. And this is a part of the conversation around equity that's really important for us to understand. This conversation, even for those of you who say, it's not my responsibility to help a different community than my own, you yourself will gain more by seeing the opportunities of others grow. So it's important for us to understand that here we see that the median hourly wage by race and ethnicity, 1979, for all individuals, 2260. For people in 2019 is 2120. We're all going backwards, but some of us are going backwards more aggressively than others. When we work and have a collective goal of improving our whole community for everyone, we will all continue to thrive much more aggressively in a positive fashion than otherwise. Wrapping up the last 3 slides here, just wanted to cover youth preparedness. This is a slide that's interesting. We know that we've talked a lot, and the report highlights a lot of areas in which people of color are moving in a negative fashion or not moving as rapidly in a positive fashion. But here is an interesting one in which this talks about students who are not enrolled in high school and less likely to finish high school. The white population was at 18%, which was in a much better place in 1990 than Latinx and people of color. Here they've stagnated. The good news is that we've got the populations, diverse populations of color, we've got them much higher enrollment and higher graduation rates. But again, this conversation is about finding what it is that we do strategically to help the individual populations that are there. Most of these solutions are going to focus on how do we help those communities of color because they are historically and contemporarily set with higher barriers. But 18% was too low or was too high in 1990, and it's definitely too high in 2019. One of the things I just wanted to talk about real briefly is seeing as being seen. So I mentioned I went to Conestoga Valley, and when I was in Conestoga Valley, I went through kindergarten through my senior year, didn't have a single non-white instructor, not a single non-white teacher, not a single non-white coach. And I remember a conversation in which one of my Black classmates really, really wanted to be a basketball player, really was all he focused on. And the teacher said, why are you focusing on this? You're not going to be a professional basketball player. You need to be more practical. You need to figure out something else. And one of the things they listed as a possibility was a teacher. But the reality is, for at least 13 years in that school district, that kid was more likely to be a professional basketball player or get a scholarship in basketball than he was going to be a teacher hired in that district. It is really important that we have people in places of authority and influence that all of our community can see and look up to and see the possibilities of being a certain thing. These numbers across the board are too low. You can see compared to the student body, the only one that was really playing in the realm of where the student body is the school district of Lancaster. But this should not be a conversation about the city school being the place for people of color and all the other schools being places for white students. I'm going to skip this video only because of time, but what this video talks about is health, equality versus equity, and I'll just leave it at the screen share here, just showing, right? So equality is giving everyone a bike, and equity is understanding the challenges of an individual, whether it's the gentleman who's taller than the bike that was given, the individual who needs different access devices for mobility, the child who's given the same size bike, and all those various things. So we won't play that video, but just want to reinforce that health equity component influences all the things that we have, the ability to go and maintain a regular schedule at work, the ability to work in a place that is reasonably accessible for you, all those kinds of conversations. The report, I'll last say, and I'm going to invite my colleagues back up right now, so please come back on video and unmute yourself. The report is significant. I just gave you a very brief sort of touch point on some of the things that have interested me, and I can weave my own personal narrative through. But the report has a massive amount of detail and other categories like justice that we didn't even sort of talk here in this brief overview. So with that being said, I'm going to take a deep breath and let Amber here take over.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. And I think it's important to take that deep breath, right? As I'm listening to what you're saying and how you weaved in your own personal narrative and how that is striking me. So got a lot of tension in my chest, right? So I just offer that up to giving ourselves a cleansing breath and just breathing and grounding ourselves with that, because what you did was make this connection and humanizing the data, right? That these are data points, but these are actual lives of real people that look like me, and how it's impacting my ability to just live simply because of the hue of my skin, that I might not have the same outcomes. So that's really sitting with me. And so I want to offer this up to Dr. Hopkins, and thinking about that, this idea that you said of seeing is being seen, like to be seen, but also humanizing that. And Kevin, you did say you wanted us to, we did a brief introduction already. That's right. But just, right, we're good. But Dr. Hopkins, and thinking about what he shared, but also how being seen, like one, from the perspective of when I see myself in that data and what that does for me as a Black female, but also how do we humanize that? This is not just data points, but actual lives. Like what can you say in speaking to that and making meaning from that?
Well, I grew up in the city. I attended the city schools, and like Kevin, I had no Black teachers. I went to Millersville University. There were no Black teachers there either. And I was, when I joined the faculty in 1979, there were only a handful of us African American teachers. And actually, the majority, even today, is not African American who are teachers of color. There are a lot of foreign professors. But looking at the data, I see myself in there. My parents were working poor. My father was a butler, a chauffeur. He worked for Armstrong beginning in 1950. My mother was a domestic. The life expectancy numbers are sort of challenging. 75 years life expectancy for African American. Well, I just turned 80, so that tells me I'm on borrowed time. And the thing is, the real issue is economics. If you don't have access to health care, then your life expectancy is going to be short. And I look back at my parents. I lived with my parents the last 20 years of their lives. And both were retired at that time. And what they received as a pension because of their work experience would not be enough for them to live today. They got a combined pension of $900 a month. I own a house, or I'm buying a house in Lancaster Township. And if my parents were in that house, they couldn't stay there because I pay $1,600 a month in mortgage. And so, but economics are also tied to education. It's heartening to see how many students of color are finishing school. But of course, as a former educator, my question is, what is the quality of the education they've obtained? Do they have the requisite skills? Can they get into the workforce? And there have been barriers. There have always been barriers to education and to employment. I just published an article. This was the 150th year of the Chamber of Commerce, and I was asked to write an article about Black business. And so I delved into some of the history. And the problem has been not that young people of color do not get educated, is that they don't get hired. One of the studies that was done in 1925, the Department of Welfare, the State Department of Welfare, did a poverty survey of all the communities of Pennsylvania with 100 persons of color or larger. And in Lancaster, there were 2,000 persons of color, or African Americans. And of that number, 37% were native born. The reason for such a low number was that there were no jobs here, so they left. And so immigrants were the majority of the population, people who came from the South, part of the Great Migration. And so it's an issue that has to be solved locally. And it's money is involved, and that's why it's going to be difficult.
Yeah, and I appreciate so much what you said. And I'm thinking, and what you're bringing up is some of the conversation that Vanessa was having yesterday with Dr. Mark Lamont Hill. The thing that really resonated was like budget, money, finances. But I want to give Vanessa just if there's anything that resonate with you in terms of that and that tie-in that you're making in terms of, yes, we need real dollars behind this, right? And how does that sit with you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, to Dr. Hopkins' point and even to Dr. Hill's point yesterday is that there is a clear through line between prenatal experience to, your aging with dignity and good health. So those things are not kind of disconnected, but I think we approach them in a disconnected fashion. So when we think about solutions, those solutions are also disconnected, and we can't leverage resources and strategies because we're doing them in kind of bubbles. And I think, and that's not a critique. I mean, CAP does a lot of different things in this community. I think it's more about understanding that this, to your point, Dr. Hopkins, this is a big kind of elephant in the room. And, we're all trying to take a bite and make a solution here and create more access there and invest a little bit here. So it's not a critique. It's just, I think it's a realization that it is a complicated, but it was complicated and thoughtful. It isn't by accident. So when I think about that through line and I think about investments, I mean, sometimes the best investments are diversified and they're leveraged. And what we heard really clearly yesterday from Dr. Hill was that don't just tell me how impassioned you are about this inequity, show me with your strategy, with your action plan, and with your investment. And while, we think about funders and grant opportunities and budgets in the state, we also have employers. And when we think about the well-being of workforces, it's the well-being of people, because well people make well employees, which makes good business. So there's nothing independent from one another. This is an interconnected issue. And I think my biggest reflection probably post-COVID is that COVID forced us to look at our interconnectedness and to think more collaboratively about solutions. But how easily we forget, it hasn't been that long and there's already a pivot kind of back to our natural corners. So I think the data is helpful because it helps us to see the interconnectedness. I think our challenge as a community is to say, what are we willing to do differently to be more collaborative, creative, to create the solutions that we know will make the difference, not for this generation, but for the generations to come.
Yes, such an important point. And there's a couple of things coming up for me, but one of the things that I'm thinking in this moment is about the impact of isolating race, disaggregating the data. So there's oftentimes we have data points where I'll come to teams and I say, did you disaggregate the data, particularly for race? And they'll often say, no, we could, but. And my question is always, why don't you, right? So now we have this data that's showing us, we're not surprised by it, right? There's the through line through history. But in terms of like making meaning from, so we're isolating it and we're looking at race and looking at the outcomes. And part of what you're saying, Vanessa, what I'm hearing is this notion of getting back to normal, going back to the way we things used to be, going back to sleep, acting like the issue doesn't exist. What have you seen? And I'll ask this to Stacey because of your mission, right? Eliminating racism, empowering women. In terms of being intentional about talking about racism, about isolating race in the conversation, what have you seen as the benefit? Why is it worth it? What are the pathways that you've seen open up? But also, what have you seen when you avoid the conversation? What has that impact been?
Thanks a lot, Dr. Sessoms. When we avoid the conversation, we end up right where we are. And as a white woman, I really want to challenge everyone on this call, everyone who's looking at this data. If you look at a data point and you're coming out on the more positive side of that data point, I really want you to then consider what else do you need to know? So my personal practice is to find an example daily of inequity. Not because I'm focused on inequity, but because I'm focused on learning more about what it looks like so that I can understand and try to have impact. So I just want to give today's example. There was a story in the paper. I was away this weekend, so I read the papers late. There was a story about, we have an incoming governor who's making cabinet appointments, very important roles. And one of them, Secretary of Agriculture. And there was a profile about them and they seem to have a lot of experience and I don't know them. What I did learn is that 99% of the farms in Pennsylvania are run by white farmers. I also learned we have a shortage of workers in agriculture across the board. So when we think about, well, how will we address this? What are the exciting new plans and developments for agriculture? How is equity going to be part of that solution? Because 99% of farmers being white does not match the demographics of Pennsylvania. One other quick example, NPR did a story yesterday about US unemployment. We're all talking about low unemployment rates. The US rate this moment is 3.5%. But the Black female rate of unemployment is 5.5%. This is a similar dynamic that was shown in our report. And it matters because if we're thinking about solutions, we need to figure out who we're solving for. It is not that everyone is impacted equally by unemployment. And if we know who is disproportionately impacted, then we can focus our efforts even better.
And I think, again, bringing it back to actual lives of people, right? So that ties into something Vanessa said. There's other thing that was emerging for me was this deficit ideology, this deficit mindset. When we look at people that look like me and think there's something wrong with you, difference is bad, the solutions that we come up with are focused on that there's something wrong with the deficit, not looking at the system that's in place that's maintaining and perpetuating that. So I want to open it up, especially into a lesson thinking about the health inequities, but also there's something that you said in a meeting that really stuck with me about this is not the panacea, right? We have this data, but it's not the only thing. So in terms of thinking about how we look at this, the root cause analysis. So the first part of that would be numerical. Yes, we have these data points. Yes, we look at the outcomes. We can use this as a baseline to move forward, but also this social justice aspect of that. And then also this cultural and the beliefs and the shifts that need to happen there. If you can speak to that, like this is a waypoint, like, but how do we make meaning from that in terms of social justice and the culture and beliefs that we need to do?
Yeah, I think it starts with taking really a personal assessment of what we believe, and then maybe just questioning it a tiny bit. So I want to take a different perspective. I'm African-American and Latina, so I count at a couple different levels of these graphs. But I think sometimes when folks look at these graphs, and as Stacey said, maybe their race group comes out a little bit higher. The initial reaction is like, wait, but no one ever gave me anything. No one's ever given me anything. And I think that's valid, and I want to create space to validate that. But I want to challenge us in a loving way to say that inequality is in the groundwater of this country. It's in the groundwater. So if we think of that analogy, and I just happen to have my place of living, my hut, in a place where there's good water, right? So I get a lot of water, my grass is green, no one ever gave me anything, but the water under which, I'm built, there's lots of it. And then you have others who their hut is built with no water on the desert, or just a tiny amount of water. No one ever gave them anything either, right? So when we think about it's in the groundwater, then it's no one's fault. Because I think if we start getting into the blame and the shame, we just spiral. So if we think of it as it's in the groundwater, it's part of the fundament that built this country, then we have to start looking at things not at the top, but at the bottom. And say, okay, how was this built? Number one. Who was it built by? Number two. And who is it meant to benefit? Who benefits? And if we start to think of it that way, then we don't have to feel the shame or the blame or whatever it is. And we don't have to individualize it. And I think we should really look at our institutions that way, from the bottom up, because none of us built them. None of us are responsible for them. But we are responsible now to say, what is my perspective and what is going to be my individual contribution to dismantling it to the degree I can, dismantling that that inequality. So I think, where do we start? We start with me. We start with looking in the mirror and saying, what are my beliefs? When I look at this, what am I doing? What am I prepared to do? And how do I, as much as possible, eliminate the shame and the blame?
That's a word right there. And I think in talking about this individual, who we are as an individual informs a collective, right? So we have to do our own individual work. That's self-interrogation. That's ongoing journey work. And because I kind of went on this journey with you, Sam, thinking about what Alyssa said and what your colleagues have shared today, this idea of making meaning and being intentional, right? Your vision, mission, and your values, and how that aligns with you as an individual and as an organization, like from your sphere of influence, right? When you're hearing what everyone's saying, like what do you take ownership of as a social actor, right? We're getting to the justice aspect of it. We can't always sit over here in the learning stage and building capacity. What are we doing to be social actors to change people's lives? Like, how does that resonate with you? What brings up for you?
Yeah, I just want to lift up Alyssa's comments about the groundwater and taking the blame and the shame out of this, and understanding, working to understand ourselves. It starts by looking in the mirror, and as a community, we're looking in the mirror here in a different way, a thinner slice of that mirror. We talk about unemployment rates as a whole, and you say they're at a certain level, but we dig just a touch deeper, and you realize that certain communities are experiencing unemployment at a different level. And when you go item by item by item over the measures that we do planning with, and we are focused on from so many different perspectives, and you see the same repeating pattern of somehow in our community, even with all the work we've been doing and with the work that's been done and call it well-intentioned work, that we've left communities behind. I think the idea of this equity study and the reason that we were excited about being a part of it was to get that thinner slice, to dig just a little deeper, and then to start to really wrestle with what's next. What do we do with this? Let's just be honest. A study is a study. It's 97 pages. It's data that's important. It's a different perspective, but in and of itself, it does absolutely nothing. There's a quote, we are who we've been waiting for. We have to take ownership of this as a community. We have to look at our roles in the different aspects of this, dig deeper, and invest. Mark Lamont Hill was talking about, strategies. Strategies that don't have funding are basically hopes and dreams, and they don't, materialize. So we need to provide funding. We need to be investing in improvement, and you kind of, what's important to people measure and people focus on. And I'm hoping that this is important to the community, and we'll see ourselves in a different way and work together to build different strategies that lift all communities.
Yeah, and I think for you, Sam, could you just go a little bit further in terms of, so looking at this with your sphere of influence, what do you say, like how has that informed you to move forward? Like what intentions have that made, even maybe as in this process, this 18 months of process, like what has shifted for you in making new meaning in this paradigm shift?
I've been personally on a journey, a learning journey, and you've been part of that journey to really kind of understand how I view myself and how I view the community and how I engage with the community. And so as we've gone through this work, it's been a long time coming. It's been nearly 2 years of work with this collaborative group. I'm in the presence of folks who are dealing with this in a lived experience format. I come to the table as a 57-year-old white CEO. And I think I have to come with a humble heart, an open mind, and really be a sponge to accept the perspectives and things that I didn't have to deal with growing up and going through my career. So as we, as a community foundation, look to engage in the community, we're talking about this regularly as a team. And what we see the equity profile doing, the racial equity profile doing, is informing our work and being able to leverage the discretionary dollars that we have, kind of say, okay, community, bring us your best ideas. How are we going to change these numbers? How are we going to drive? How are we going to build a better future, a more equitable and just future? And so my sphere of influence, I can look at grant opportunities in the nonprofit sector from a discretionary standpoint. I can go into rooms and I can notice who's in the room and who's not in the room, and really push to have different people in the room to be able to bring their experience and their perspective in the room. So I'm holding myself accountable to passing the mic, to inviting people to have a seat at the table, and to do things that are elevating communities that have been left behind in the past.
And I think that key, and I want to open it up for all of you in thinking about, you had this collective, this steering committee that informed this work, but you also had a component about reaching out to the people in the community to get some qualitative reading and interviewing them as well, and thinking about how do we draw those connections. And I'm always thinking about, you can have, I always say, people are sitting at the ivory tower, you're making these decisions, and then when you put them into action, the people that it's impacting say that makes absolutely no sense, or that's not making any meaningful change for my actual life. So how do you make sure that this progress, or what we even think of as progress, or what we think of as an impact, is actually going to be impactful to people that you're trying to serve, if they're not at the table? So what have you done, or what are you thinking about doing to make sure that they are a part of the conversation? The people that have been doing this work in your community for generations are not left out of the conversation, that they are the leaders in this work. How do we make space for them, create that space, and kind of get out of their way, because they have wisdom that we need in order to make changes? I'll offer that to anyone.
So real quick, I want to just first identify that, the qualitative part is really important, right? So quantitative data and empirical data can actually be a really big trap, keeping us from movement. So what we wanted to do here was make sure we had a baseline on the quantitative side, but not stop there. Just using Stacey's unemployment point about the 3.5%. Now, she took one path talking about Black women, but I'm going to take another one, which is, so you got 3.5% unemployment, but they just came out with the report that 2/3 of the wealth building over the last 2 years has gone to 1% of people. If you only have 3.5% of people unemployed, then how can you possibly have that level of massive income distribution unless, back to Elisa's point about the groundwater, unless the system you live in is structurally set up to inhibit certain people from actually gaining anything, right? So at the risk of destroying any future political campaign I have, capitalism might be a scam. And by might be, I mean it is, but that's, a larger conversation. But I just spent 3 weeks in Tanzania, okay? Which is where my mom's from. It's like the second or third poorest country in Africa. It's very poor economically. Structurally, low levels of crime. Structurally, while you have a lot of poverty, there's subsistence and there's ways in which people live. But I see an advertisement for Pepsi, for like basically the equivalent of like a 20-ounce Pepsi on a billboard. So Pepsi's setting the rate. Places can't even charge more, because Pepsi's already said the cost of a Pepsi of this size is 500 Tanzanian shillings. 500 Tanzanian shillings is the equivalent of 20 cents, 20 US cents. Now, the roads are both tarmac, but a lot of dirt roads. So you can't say, well, it's easier for them to move this product from one place to another. No. Pepsi knows that they can charge poor people in America this rate, and they can charge poor people in Tanzania this rate, and it has nothing to do with any level of actual scientific reality. It is the fact that we have a structure and a willingness to accept that people are going to be massively exploited, and they don't have the power to do anything about it. Until the moral imperative changes on people in positions of leadership and authority, which are largely conferred to them because they come from families who have had authority and power, until they say, this just isn't right. I am able to charge you, I don't know, $3,000 for this apartment because my neighbor landlord is charging $3,000 for this apartment. I didn't buy a new property. I didn't put any work into it. I just decided that since the market went up, I can now charge. No, I'm going to still charge $1,500 because the economic conditions of me haven't changed, and I'm going to do the right thing, not the possible thing. And we've got to see a moral shift from individuals who have the ability to make those decisions, not to live to a god of capitalism, which simply says exploit your neighbor as much as you can, and you are okay morally to do so.
Any points you want to make there, like in terms of what he said? Because what stuck out to me was you said this willingness to accept, right? This is what we do. We create a narrative in our head that, well, it's their fault or it's those people, and that they're different than us, and not seeing that through line of our common humanity. So that really stuck out for me. With anything that else resonated with you?
So there's also sometimes there's a unique kind of coming together of what's morally right and what might be economically right in a community. And when you look at the data that says 26% of youth under 18 are people of color in Lancaster County at this point, while only 7% are over 65. What that indicates is a massive shift. If we're going to prosper as a community, we have to acknowledge that shift. We have to prepare for it. And our industry, our businesses need to engage in different practices to pave the way for success of our next generation. And that next generation doesn't look like me. It's shifting, and we have to be prepared for that. So I think there's a way for us to couple, enlightened self-interest with moral clarity to build a thriving economy for everyone. And again, you get to the last data point in the survey, almost $2 billion of GDP left on the table. I mean, that's a number that's a real number. And the transformation for our people of color, our families, what they have, the healthcare, the amenities that they have access to, the lifestyle that they have access to, it's profound.
And I just wanted to build on that, Dr. Sessoms, because I think that's really a key point, is that sometimes folks give into the illusion that to create more equity means if I have more and you have less, I have to give you something I have. And therefore now I have less. And that mindset, it makes sense, right? It's logical, but that's not the way equity works. So if I have more and you have less and you get more, you know what happens? I get more. And then you can maybe get more, and then I get more. But guess what? I still have more now than I did before. So equity actually has this effect where as people who have less get more, there is more created. And I'm talking economics here. So as Sam said, there's almost $2 billion with a B, $2 billion of GDP potential in Lancaster County if we were to eliminate inequality. And that $2 billion is not just distributed among people of color. It is part of our collective economic well-being. So I think, there's so many different ways to look at this. But if we really just think dollars and cents, which some people do, and that's the way they think, no judgment on that, there is a cost to everyone. So I'd like to say this even more clearly. White people are harmed by racism. White people are harmed by racism. They're harmed morally, they're harmed economically, they're harmed socially. Racism is bad for everyone. It's bad for everyone. So as we really look at our systems, our structures, our processes, who benefits, who does it, what was it created for? I'd really like us to have that perspective and not just think that what we're doing is making improvements for people who look like me, which, I look great. So it's wonderful to have improvements for people who look like me, but it's also really about improvements for everybody, And there is the potential here in Lancaster County from a financial perspective and from a GDP perspective for all of us to do better.
Yes, I see a lot of you nodding your heads. I see a lot of people in the chat. What's coming up for you? Because that you said collective, and I'm like, there is something. What is that barrier? But also, what's the opportunity there that we can look at us versus them? You know, like James Baldwin talked about it a lot. There's a lot of people that talk about this. I exist because I'm in opposition to you. Like me being a Black woman is defined in opposition to what whiteness is and what, you know, gender is and all these things. So how do we get past this idea? And that goes back to the cultural beliefs of looking at it, us versus them. So that scarcity complex that we have, that's a myth that we have bought into because of capitalism. All of these things, it's unlearning that needs to happen. So as you've gone on this journey, you have been unlearning things. You've been in community with each other. You've been forming a collective. And how do we start broadening that and envisioning that for the entire county? That there is a collaboration that can happen here. People are doing good work in the city. They might not be intentional in some aspects of looking at it through an equity lens or a race lens. But when you look at your vision and mission statements for your companies, I can always see it within there, right? You might not think about it. You're like, oh my gosh, when you talk about, I think about schools preparing kids for a global society. That's very much a common thread when you see in schools. That is talking about equity. That's talking about justice, equity, diversity, inclusion. So how do you then shift it and say, how do I make meaning out of that? How do we start building this collective? And for you as the people that have been steering this and how we want to bring it out to the community, when Sam talked about the data on students, I'm a school psychologist. That is very imperative. Like this is the next generation and we are leaving them behind. We are spirit murdering our children. And what impact does that have on our future? And what was within our sphere of influence? Even if I don't work in K through 12, what is my obligation, my moral obligation to ensure that our kids are fully seen, that they can be their full selves, that they can thrive and not just survive?
I mean, I think what's been interesting for me, and so many good points are being made, it's think about what we do next. I think the next thing that we could do is look at this data, but also look at the solutions that are currently in play and say, do these solutions actually solve for this issue of inequity? And if they do not, there is more work to be done. Then you're not at the point of the solution where it's fully realized, right? So I think that's step one, is like, now we have baseline data when it comes to the sons of inequity. What are we working on? Because there are lots of conversations in this community happening around education and healthcare and housing and all kinds of issues that are in our basic, what we need to just to live a basic human life that we're trying to address. But are we looking at it through this lens of inequity, and are we solving for it? And if we're not, what's in the way? Is it the under-resourcing of it? Is it not understanding it? Is it policy? What is it? And then we solve for that. So I think for me, what has been exciting about this process is understanding that now we have data to help us affirm for maybe others, confirm for those of us who live in the skins that we live, that, you know, this experience is real, and that it is, to Elisa's point, it's damaging for everyone because we can't fully thrive as a community. I think there is an interesting space, though, that I've been really exploring between this idea of we survive. I think there are communities of color that in our being, from generation to generation, from ancestor to ancestor, we are taught to have the grit to survive. And then we talk about people thriving. That's in my mission statement. What I'm trying to get curious about is how do we help people strive in that there has to be a growing and a dreaming and a hope that happens for people between the place of survival and thriving. And I think if we look at the issues that we're dealing with and we look for solutions, that's going to help create the space where people are striving, and then we can move to the next place. So I just feel really called to say, like, look at the data, but look at your solutions. Are they doing anything? And if they're not, you got to get back to it, back to the table, because we're not there yet.
That mindful inquiry, that compassionate curiosity. I love that, getting curious, right? We often stop short of asking ourselves the question that's going to make that meaningful change because of the things that you've all been talking about today. So how do we get to that? And I think you've been developing that. You develop that in communities, you develop it in people that think differently than you, that have a different lived experience, and that they broaden your awakening. You're like, you're coming out of this dormancy. You're having this awakening. So how do you not go back into that slumber? How do you keep moving forward, and how do you bring people into that fold? So this idea of even, we've talked about this before about like calling people in, calling people out versus those two things. Like in your communities, when you're seeing that harm is being done, or where people in your community will say, you have harmed me. How do we build relationships with those people within your sphere of influence? I'm building this community so that we now have this social responsibility. I can be accountable to you. We have an accountability partner so that we can continue to flourish together. If you all have your spheres, and I see some things in the chat about not working in silos, how do we continue to do that, right? About is access and opportunity. It's so important. And there's a book in there about the sum of us and how there's a through line. We can't do this work. And that's, and thinking about Dr. Hopkins, and there has to be the historicity of race is important in this. If you do not talk about the history, the through line, especially particular to the county, we will keep coming back around in a circle. So when we try to do that in isolation, it leads to these narratives of difference, of deficit, but that through line is important. So in terms of thinking about the history and what the just unveiling that you had in the city and all of these things, how do you see the history of the community, and how is that imperative to know that history so that we can get to where we need to get to?
Well, I think dialogue has to precede action. One of the problems we have, we don't know each other. We live next to each other, but we really don't know each other. I got some reactions from my essay where people said, well, that's astounding. I didn't realize how difficult it was being Black living in Lancaster County. Well, if you never investigate, you never find out. And I think we're making a start here with this webinar, but we have to go beyond this. And the future of the county is in the schools. When I worked with the Urban League over 40 years ago, I wanted to shift the focus of the organization from job creation to education, because the problem was not access to employment, it was preparation for employment. And we need to work with young people. With 26%, at this time, we need to prepare them for what the future brings, and let them know that they are players. They're not just objects of a program, but they are going to be the actors in our future.
Any other thing that's coming up for you? I'm looking at the Q&A now, but.
Just want to mention that when we think about that employment and that access and that opportunity thing, there's one of the challenges, and Vanessa pointed this out, right? Like, you don't go from beginning to end without the middle. And the reality is that we have structures, we have histories, we have Eurocentric ways of, most of us on this call either are presently actively directors of organizations or certainly serve on boards or have, right? And so, we at United Way right now, we're doing Project Blueprint, where we train sort of underrepresented individuals on how to serve on boards. And it's a program we used to do. We've been updating it. In the past, we focused on the individuals, and we're doing that as well. But this time we said, whoa, we've got to meet with the organizations before we meet with the individuals. Because we're sending, in some cases, right, you're sending sheep to slaughter because the institutions you're sending them to aren't prepared for the conversation of inclusion, aren't prepared for the conversation of welcome, aren't prepared to have a community that belonging means not just transforming them, but transforming us and allowing us to be transformed as a space. And so, we've got to understand that, we have to, in the process of welcoming community, we have to make sure people understand how to live within the structures of power and systems that presently and currently exist. Even if long-term we want those to be able to sort of shift and modify, we have to be able to provide some of that transitional training to live in the spaces that exist as they are. And when we think about that access and opportunity to jobs in particular, one of the things that we often see for individuals of color who are maybe older, mid-career or older, is they show up. They've got a degree from 10 or 15 years ago in a particular field they were really interested in and studied hard for, and they didn't get a job. And they didn't get a job. And now 10 years have passed, and you look at the resume and you're like, well, we're not going to give them an interview for this job in the field they studied 10 years ago because they've never had any experience. Well, you're just judging based on what someone else denied that opportunity. Now you're part of the denial of opportunity. I think of, Miss Hazel I. Jackson, who, the Hand Middle School was just renamed after a former United Way board member and incredible community member. She waited 9 years to get a job as a teacher. She'd already been a teacher in South Carolina. She waited 9. I can't think of anything in my life I've ever studied or been interested in that I would show up Friday after Friday after Friday and sit in the lobby because I know they're giving other people opportunities for interviews and telling me the job is already filled. That kind of, we talk about resilience as a positive. We've got to stop talking about resilience as a positive, because when you talk about communities, they're so resilient. You said it's okay for us to continue putting barriers in front of them to overcome. Resilience, while great on an individual level, is an indication that structurally you have denied people fair and equitable access to the opportunity. You've forced them to have to be tougher and stronger. I love what Vanessa said about many of our communities have been trained that you have to have that grit. My dad, my white father, came and sat with me and my brothers and said, "You're going to have to work twice as hard as I do. You're going to get punished twice as much for mistakes as I do. It's not fair." And every Black parent has that same conversation with their kids. That's not the way that we should be praising people. Is, "Oh, you're so great at overcoming the barriers I put in front of you." Well, let's stop putting the barriers.
And that willingness to accept things. And that's for ourselves too, that unlearning that I'm doing is working 10 times as hard just to be seen because I'm a Black woman, and how that has harmed me, right? That racial trauma and how that lives in my body and what that does long-term to my quality of life. Yes. There are some questions, and I encourage people that are in this space to add your Q&A. And I'll say this first question that came up to me a few times yesterday at the breakfast. So people will come up to me and say, "Okay, the profile's out there, the data's out there. What are we going to do about it?" Right? So what are the next steps in Lancaster? And it's great to have it, but what are we going to do? So that is the question. Like, will there be discussion of next steps in Lancaster? What does that look like moving forward? What are the next steps? The doing.
Hi, Amber. I'd love to jump in on that one. One of the things folks will find in the long version of the data is some summary information about ideas of response in other communities, right? So other communities that have had these similar outcomes, what are some of the tools they have used, policy tools that they have used? But I also want to remind us that we don't need to create a new thing, right? We don't need to create a new group to work on some of these issues, because the issues are not new and people have been doing the work a long time. I want to identify 3 examples, just briefly. Patients are waiting. This is a group many people have heard of. One of their summary statements I love so much, they want to build a Black doctor factory here in Lancaster County. This is one of those statements, when you break it really down, that benefits everybody because everyone's health would improve. So patients are waiting is one. Another one I'm thinking about is obviously the immense energy that has been put into the fair funding, lawsuit, legislation, and advocacy efforts, and power interface work for years. This is an effort that could drastically change the futures of children in Lancaster County immediately, because it would address these disparities in the school funding. I also want to lift up a somewhat newer organization. I'm not saying it's a new effort, the Bail Fund, and people really doing education around why are so many people sitting in Lancaster County Prison who are on bail but haven't been convicted, and they can't make bail because of the economic disparities that we are discussing here. What if we found out that the new prison that is under discussion only needs to be half the size that's being discussed, because that's really how many people would be incarcerated? If we found that out and we proceeded down that path, that saves all of us a significant amount of money. So these are just 3 current examples of work that is underway right now that anyone can support and learn more about. That doesn't mean we've addressed every single issue. I do want to stay focused on the economics. Every leader in this community has a responsibility to examine this data and examine their organizations and understand where pivots need to be made.
And I think what's resonating was someone in chat said, thank you, Stacey, for lifting up current efforts and great work, giving visibility. That is what we need to do. Like, there are already efforts. I think what happens, and it goes back to Kevin said something that in his presentation about being seen, right? I know what it feels like to be invisible, to feel erased, to be gaslit, right? For the work that is so imperative and important. So when you're doing that, there's work that's already being done. How are you making sure that they are in the planning process, in that strategic plan, like not doing things in the absence of them? But I think that is so important, giving the visibility. Where are these groups that have been doing this tremendous work, and how do we support them with funding? Some of y'all in this space got some money, right? Like, so how do we do that to make sure that the efforts that they're doing, because it impacts all of us, right? Anything else you wanted to add to that, this idea of like the next steps? But those things are important, the convening and bringing people that are already doing the work together, amplifying their voices, making sure that they have the space and the tools they need to continue their work.
Well, one is stop doing things that aren't good. So one of the biggest challenges in sort of the philanthropic sector, I mean, you know, we have money, but we don't always have the ability to make decisions with it, right? So I am the CEO of United Way. I make almost zero actual decisions around where funding goes. I've got committees, I've got all these other things. Now I can speak into that, absolutely, or frame that, but I'm not the decision maker other than a couple of thousands of dollars of like sponsorship money. Like, I'm not making the $500,000 grant decisions, right? And so I can work on that, trying to help us as an organization undo some of the type of processes that we have, which is just as important as doing new things in some cases. I also want to mention that that's what I can do. A large part of this is also the question is put back to the community here. What can you do? What, to your point, Amber, you said there are groups who are doing work, and in some cases, it's about getting them to the table, helping them understand how these mechanisms work. Like, here's how our grant works. Like, you have to hit a deadline, or else your grant gets thrown out and isn't even considered, even if it's the greatest grant idea ever, right? Like, understanding processes for some of those groups that are doing this work is really important. But I also want to just say that we have got to accept the fact, particularly in the donor community, we've got to accept the fact that what we have always done hasn't worked, right? So please let us innovate. Like, if you are a large funder, give us the space to be innovative, to do new things or do it differently. Sometimes our best practices are actually a handcuff from real solutions, because we're just doing what was really not a best practice. It was a better practice, or the best practice we've gotten to so far. Poverty still hovered at 12% since the 1970s to today. So let us actually try to do some new things instead of presuming that because we've always done it this way, something else might be worse.
That status quo doesn't work.
And I would say it's about risk orientation, Kevin, as well, is that in the corporate world, when you're making a widget, you know, there is space in the laboratory for risk and innovation and tweaking something, and that version doesn't work. So then you update it. And those of us who have iPhones, we're on what? 14, I don't know what version, you know, so I think there's that space too, that in the work that we are doing, that there is a need for space for taking risks and trying, innovating, responding, that shouldn't feel punitive. And I think there's also a space in which, you know, we're going to be good stewards. We're going to be good stewards of the dollars. We want, you know, we want that collective human experience to be better for all. So trusting that. And I guess the other piece that, you know, I'm really thinking a lot about lately is just trying to figure out, how do we ensure that voices are centered and compensated? So it's, you know, when we think about those of us who are in these spaces, who have access to these rooms and these tables, it does help when Sam says, I'm going to say less, Vanessa, you say more in this space. But there is another group of people who live in our neighborhoods, who go to our churches, whose voices also are important. And needs to be centered and needs to be compensated as such. So, you know, we try to build in practices within our budgets that If we're going to ask parents to give us feedback about something, we're going to compensate them for their time because they're an expert and they're giving us expert content. So just those are the ways that we're reimagining this idea of what that looks like. And I think it's important. It's not easy, but it's part of that, because I think the long game here is that some of the work that we're doing for CAP is really this kind of multiple generational approach. It takes time. So from a funding perspective, you're not going to see the outcomes or the fruit of this labor. If we do it, if we get it right. For my family, my grandmother came here from Puerto Rico to the States in 1950 something to get the dream, right? Do the thing. It took her whole life, her 7 children's whole lives, to get the thing that she sees in her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, which is educated access to, you know, career pathways and economy so that we can live the life that we deserve. But it took 2 generations for us to get there. And sometimes we want people to come into a nonprofit store and like, boom, we fixed it. And it's a generational problem. You know, it is a generational curse that we're trying to break. So I think we've got to be conscious about the time it takes.
I just want to add, you know, as a funder and a person who's plugged into the nonprofit community, I agree with all of everything that's been said. You know, we're looking for ways, you know, to encourage innovation through some of our discretionary grants. We have, similar to Kevin, we have money that goes out that we don't necessarily control, but within the dollars that we control, we want to invest in innovative processes and new ideas and bring new ideas to the table. The thing that we're doing is really kind of really assessing how this equity profile can be wrapped into our entire grant making conversation so that we don't lose this slice of what is important. And look, if you look at the data from 1990 to 2020, I mean, it's an epic failure. We have not moved the needle. We have to look in the mirror and we have to say what we have done over the past several decades, we cannot do over the next several if we want real change to happen. So I think we're looking, again, from the standpoint of a nonprofit funder and saying, what can we do different? How can we fully embrace the data that's in the study, and how can we motivate, encourage, cajole, persuade organizations to look deeply at what they're doing? That's what we're doing. I think the most important question that we can ask isn't what you're doing to drive this. It's what I'm doing. What am I going to do as an individual? How can I engage? How can I be a part of positive change? Where are the entry points? What am I passionate about? What organizations am I connected to? I think that's a key question for individuals today, is what piece of this do you want to own and can you own? And even if it's just the idea of sharing this with your network, sharing this with your family and friends, with your coworkers, what's important to you, and sharing what you value. It's amazing what change can come of that. The other thing is we work in the nonprofit sector predominantly. It's the smallest sector of our economy. The idea that the power of the real economy, the private sector, the power of policy and government is incredible. And we have to have folks in government and folks in the private sector engaged in this conversation if we want to make real change. It can't be just limited to this circle, the squares here, the nonprofit leaders. It's got to be a broader community effort. So we encourage that.
And so much of what I'm hearing is this collective building community. There's a question in the chat about shared language. And what I have found in facilitating it and holding space for people is that you develop shared language from being community. When you think about affinity groups, or you think about moving to caucuses, actually making real changes, when I'm in a group of people, when I'm in that room and working on a shared struggle, I'm developing the discourse and the language and the tools I need to move it forward. So many people in the chat are saying, have another conversation, let's have another meeting. This is thought-provoking. We don't create the space to even challenge the status quo, to even give ourselves permission to be like, this has not worked for centuries. for a decade. This has not worked. Why do we keep doing the same thing, right? So having these spaces and convenings is so important. And Sam, and to your point about, we have to look beyond this and looking at, the 3 prongs that Policy Link talked about is the public outreach, data-driven outreach, and policy outreach. So how do we make sure and ensure those buckets? Because we can stay in diversity. We can say we need to diversify our boards. I hear that a lot with teams, but moving again towards the policy, towards that social justice, being a social actor and doing what needs to be done to impact real lives is the work. But part of that does start in just having the conversation and convening and meeting people and having that shared struggle of here's what I see, and I now have a collective of moving this forward. So that's where that shared language comes from. But do we have a responsibility? Like, does this community have responsibility to think about what is that shared language? Because when you have that language of what equity is, and Kevin, you started off with that, when you understand fundamentally what it is, it helps to advance the work in meaningful ways instead of thinking about it's taking something away from me, right? And also there's some questions in here about globally and locally, about this debate and planning. But again, this concern comes up from our community. And I get that very much as a Black woman. Like, we see this data all the time and the harm that it causes me, because we have people that come together and convene and they say all the great things, and then I don't see any changes, or it fizzles out again, right? What is going to be different this time? You've had a similar experience years ago. So your community is asking you, can I trust you to really see me, to really make meaningful change for me? And how do we do this collectively? Like, finally getting together and rolling our sleeves up is something that's coming up and emerging for people, like this trust that they want to have and believe and have that hope. So building that beloved community. How do we really go about it? Thinking about MLK, what does that mean? And having that struggle. And then also, Dr. Hopkins, they want to link to your article. They want to link to your article in the comments, but thinking about the narrative, the storytelling, and how that's impactful. But how do we compensate? How do we not do this as performative racial theater? This is not racial theater. We can have people tell their stories. Like Vanessa said, like so many of you said, like, this is rich data that we can use as wisdom to move this forward. So how do we honor the people that are, like Dr. Leroy Hopkins, what he's sharing his story, the people in the community that have shared their story for this policy? Like, how do we honor all of that and use that as wisdom to really impact and change their lives? There's some trust building, there's community building that I'm hearing here, and what is within our sphere of influence to really work on that trust and building that community. But any final thoughts that I see here? There's another community conversation happening tomorrow. So there's a thing, right? We have all these people that are doing this work. So Together We Can, a town hall for targeting hidden injustices on March 18th. So like Lancaster Justice Seekers organization. Reinventing our communities. So it's Black and Brown small business owners through the Lancaster Foundation. There's all this great work. So how do we showcase that? How do we amplify the work that's being done? And how do we make sure, as so many of you said, that it's actually making an impact on the people it needs to make an impact for?
So just because I'm looking at time and playing my technical host hat here, we're at 1:25. I want to make sure, particularly Dr. Leroy Hopkins, Lisa, we haven't heard from you two in a while, but sort of wrap up thoughts if we can head towards that.
I think the information is out there. It's a matter of just discussing it, finding a venue. As far as my article that was published by it's in the Journal of the Lancaster County Historical Society. So just go to a library and you can find it. But I think the dialogue is the important thing. And it's true, there are many fine efforts out there, but not everyone is aware of them.
And just to build on that, don't look for one hero or one shero or one group to do this. Don't expect this group or any other group to solve this problem. The more conversations we're having, the more places these conversations are happening, the better. I don't think we should look for a convener. I think that in and of itself is what has happened for so many decades after decades after decades. And what happens is that convener, they lose their life. So I think we take the spirit of MLK forward and we say, how many new conversations can I start? How many new conversations can I be a listener in? And we start to see that happening in a lot of different ways, and we get engaged, we get involved, and we ask those who represent us what their position is on equity. And we start to say that equity is an expectation across the board, and really ask those folks to live up to that in meaningful and measurable ways.
Just to build on Alyssa and Tony's words, it's a risky thing to say as a CEO. I don't know. I don't have an answer, but I believe, and it's true, I don't have an answer, but I believe our community has the wisdom, that the wisdom exists in our community. And I think the more conversations we can have and the more perspectives we can invite toward this issue, the better chance we have at moving the needles across many of these data points in the future. And that's our commitment. Our commitment is to listen and look for opportunities to create real change.
You're already inspiring people. As someone put in there that I'd love to have this data, take it to the local churches and have a discussion with congregation. There are ways that you can be innovative and see this through. I love that this is inspiring people to take ownership of it and make meaning of it the way they do. There's no one way to do this, but building that community is the key. So you think about MLK, like that's what he did, but we also have to start thinking and being innovative. Even like that's how it happened in the civil rights era. We're in a different era. We see all these grassroots, we see these young people doing the work. How do we envision it differently and give them the space to do it their way, right? And lead them along the way, because we're all towards that common goal. But it's just an honor to be, this is healing for me. And I know, and I trust and believe that, right, you're doing this work from your sphere of influence, and it's going to see the change, significant changes. And your community is rallying behind you, and they're looking at this and being innovative. And the chat is just engaging, and they're dropping articles and dropping next events. But to Dr. Hopkins' point about if it's finding a venue or becoming aware what's going on, you're doing such rich things. We just need to know about it. So how do we stay informed? How do we stay engaged? And how do we build that collective together? But thank you so much for joining us. We're building that beloved community, one bucket at a time within your sphere of influence. How do you build your community to get to where we need to get to impact the actual lives of people that deserve to be centered, that deserve to be seen? The invisibility and erasure harms all of us. So how do we do our part to make sure that you're seen, you're heard, you're validated, and your humanity is not up for discussion? It is, dignity is inherent, and I honor you just simply because you exist and you live and you breathe. So thank you so much for joining us. People are looking for further conversations. So thank you, United Way and YWCA for convening this space for us to have the conversation. And I look forward to seeing y'all again soon.
Yep, so real quick, wrap up just to say that we will distribute this via email as usual. So if you registered for this, you'll get this. And so, hey, one easy thing, if you thought this was a valuable conversation, please go ahead and share this with your colleagues, with your friends, with your church community. And I guarantee you, any one of the people on this conversation would be willing to come and work with your community and help we can advance and talk about what we're doing. So please, as always, there's a lot of nonprofits here. If you've got a couple extra dollars to share, we'd be glad for them. Any one of them, all of them, continue to find ways to involve yourself in the activities and volunteer opportunities you have. Serving on committees. I've got a VITA poster right over here. Last year, 153 volunteers brought back or saved $18 million in tax refunds and tax prep fees last year. Find a way that you can take your time, your energy, your effort, your awareness, or your communities and push this conversation into the spheres of influence that you have. You may not think you have a sphere of influence, but unless you sit by yourself and talk to no one all the time, I guarantee you there are people watching you, your children, your neighbors, your friends. And what you do will lead us into a better community. Thank you, everybody. We appreciate you.